Hello and welcome everyone to our second online session of the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance on demystifying the operation of electric school buses in Canada. My name is Nicole Roach, a Sustainable Transportation Manager at Green Communities Canada, and I will be your co-host for this 1.5-hour event alongside my colleague, Valerie Tremblay. CESBA is a joint initiative of Green Communities Canada and Équiterre, made possible with financial support of the Troptier family, ECHO, and Consecon foundations. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the many treaty and traditional territories of Indigenous nations throughout Canada. We are grateful for the continued work of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, who are the original caretakers of the land and waters. In our work, we have a responsibility to respect Indigenous perspectives and elevate Indigenous voices. And today I'm joining virtually from the traditional land of the Anishinaabe people, situated on Lake Simcoe Treaty 16 territory. On the agenda today, we first have a quick presentation by Équiterre, who will introduce CESBA, the state of school bus electrification across Canada, myths and barriers of ESB adoption, and our panelists. This will be followed by 3 presentations by leading experts from Propulsion Quebec, Highland Electric Fleets, and Dunsky Energy and Climate. There will be a short discussion session after each presentation, so if you have any questions during the presentations, please write them in the questions tab at the bottom right of your screen, and we will share them orally with the panelists. And for anything else, such as comments, reactions, or links, you can use the chat function. We will end with a panel discussion on innovations and recommendations related to the operation of electric school buses. Please also note that the workshop is being recorded and that the recording will be made available after the event. I will now pass it over to Valerie for context and introductions.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello, everyone. My name is Valérie Tremblay. I am an advisor for sustainable mobility and transportation project at Équiterre, and I'm also responsible for coordinating the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance with my colleague, Nicole. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, CESBA is a Canada-wide coalition of organizations from environmental NGOs and health associations to fleet operators and EV advocacy groups, and we're all advocating for policies that accelerate school bus electrification. So basically, we aim to see that all Canadian school bus fleets are electrified by 2040 or sooner. And so to achieve this, we organize events such as this one to facilitate networking and knowledge sharing among stakeholders, and we work on developing strategies and recommendations to accelerate the uptake of ESBs at the federal and provincial levels of government, but more specifically in the provinces of PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. So right now across Canada, there are approximately 51,000 school buses, with 70% of those still running on diesel, unfortunately. So ESBs would only represent a fraction of Canada's school bus fleet, even in jurisdictions where policy and funding in support of ESB procurement have been adopted. PEI is currently leading the way with 25% of its fleet electrified, which is about 82 ESBs out of a fleet of 322. And BC and Quebec are following its lead with about 5% of their respective fleets being electrified, but we're expecting hundreds more of ESBs in the coming years. And Ontario and New Brunswick are respectively at 0.1 and 0.08%, while Nova Scotia has still 0 ESBs out of its fleet of 1,300 buses. So clearly, there's still a long way to go. Yet in our first session, we made the case for school bus electrification in Canada, presenting the health, climate, and economic benefits of transitioning to ESBs. So why are fleet operators still reluctant to make this switch? Well, it's important to note that the actors for operating school buses are different from one province to another, similarly to the bus procurement process. For instance, in Quebec, it's private school bus service operators, whereas in BC and New Brunswick, it's mostly school districts, while in Nova Scotia, it's regional education centers. While stakeholders might vary from a province to another, the myths and BSBs And the myths and barriers related to ESB's operation appear similar across all provinces. Among those, we have that ESBs aren't as reliable or don't last as long as diesel buses. Planning charging needs can be complex or time-consuming. Range isn't enough to cover trips in one charge. Performance is easily affected by road and weather condition, or that power supply isn't enough for the increased demand in energy. So today's webinar is intended to demystify some of these technical logistics of operating an ESB fleet, from driving and repairing to charging and powering, that often delay and hinder fleet operators from making the transition. And so to do this, we have invited a panel of experts in transportation electrification. So we are first joined by Stéphane Pascalon, Senior Project Officer at Propulsion Québec. Stéphane has worked in the automotive field for more than 25 years, including 11 in electrification. He's an expert in EV awareness, and he took part in the first EV prototype development and acted in the deployment of EV fleets, such as taxi, driving school vehicles, and in industries through the plug-in fleet projects. So welcome, Stéphane. And we also welcome Brad Laporte, who's the Canadian Regional Business Manager for Highland Electric Fleets. Brad's role over those past 2 years with Highland has been to mitigate risk for customers, increase ESB market penetration, and deliver a positive impact across a broad spectrum of stakeholders, from children, communities, and school districts to political leaders and OEMs. Welcome, Brad. And finally, we are glad to have on the panel today Jeff Turner, Director of Clean Mobility at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisor. Jeff holds more than a decade of experience working with vehicle manufacturers, research institutes, utilities, and governments. His work has covered personal and commercial fleet vehicle engineering to EV charging infrastructure and vehicle grid technology. Welcome, Jeff. And so to start off today's webinar, I will now hand it over to Stéphane, who will present key information about electric buses and infrastructure. As a reminder, if you have questions during any presentation, please put them in the question tab and we will share them with the panelists.
Thank you, Valérie. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So I'm Stéphane Pascalon. So I'm a Senior Project Manager at Propulsion Québec, as Valérie just said. And today I will talk about the Transporter Plus guide and also electric buses and charging infrastructure. So Propulsion Québec is involved in many projects in transportation electrification and also smart mobility. And we published last summer a guide, a Transporter Plus guide, who is intended to be central place for information for the fleet manager in order to help them in the transition to electric school bus. When you look at this guide, you will see that you will find all the steps to electrify your fleet. You will find the different options available to as a vehicle, also as charging infrastructure, and also on the financial side, which is one key of the transition. This guide is dedicated for small and medium fleet. When you are managing a large fleet of vehicle, usually you have your own team to manage that. So it's more for a smaller fleet who don't have the resource to manage the transition, and electric transition requires some resource. So at the end of the guide, you will have also some tip and resource from people who already start the transition. So you will have example and experience from a company who already did the transition. So when you are doing the transition, you have 5 steps which are very important. And the first one is a key step, which is the planning. Changing a vehicle from a ICE combustion engine to an electric transmission is not just replacing a vehicle by another, and the planning is key in the success of the project. So the second step will be to select your bus, charger, and the software related to that. And I will talk a little bit more about that step today. And then you implement a pilot project, then you adapt all your building and infrastructure, and then comes the testing and the deployment. So if we go more in detail regarding the vehicle, when we talk about electric school bus, the vehicle is not treated just as a vehicle. It's treated as a complete system, and they are related to their infrastructure and everything which comes with it. So when you choose a bus, you choose the seat capacity, you choose the range, but it's not just those characteristics that you have to take care of. You need to pay attention of the charging capacity and the charging options that are available for those buses. You need to take into account some maintenance requirements and all those kind of things. So it's choosing a vehicle is no longer picking one vehicle with 48 seats and that's it. It's really taking into account the vehicle plus the charging infrastructure and the way you will operate it in the future. So you have to ask you many different questions in order to choose the right vehicle. You are on the market right now about 9 different models of electric school bus available across Canada from 5 different manufacturers. So when you choose, you have to choose through many things, but one thing is that they all have the same architecture. So and this architecture will have some impact on the maintenance on your vehicle. So electric motor is different than the ICE combustion engine for sure, but it requires less maintenance. You don't have to do an oil change and stuff like that. But electric motor is a key for the vehicle because it does the transmission, but it also does the generation of energy when you decelerate in order to get the energy back. So electric motor requires less maintenance, but usually you have to understand how it works for your maintenance team. You have a converter in an electric school bus, and this converter is the key component which helps the battery to talk with the motor and make everything work and give the right command to the different components. This component is electric and electronic, and meaning that for your maintenance team, you will have to develop new skills. So it's very important to consider the training on your maintenance team. If you have a very small fleet, you can consider doing the maintenance directly with the manufacturer and having a maintenance agreement with the manufacturer, because developing those skills could cost a lot. So it's but you need to consider this in your transition. When it comes to the battery, you have to consider that the battery is built as different modules. And when the maintenance of the battery is done, it's easier with the battery as a smaller module than a big battery pack. And then when you have a problem, you have to change the complete pack, which is much more expensive than having smaller module. And then you can change just a small module, replace it by another one, and the cost could be reduced in terms of maintenance. You need to consider that through the year you will have a capacity loss, so it means that the range will decrease a little bit through the edge of your bus. So the way you are using your bus, you will put it on a longer route at the beginning and smaller route every year because you have this loss. For the charging, you have different options for the charging, and you need to pick the right one. So depending on the charging time you have, depending on the fleet size you have, and depending on the cost. So charging could be done with 2 different things. You have the level 2 charging and the level 3 charging. Level 2 charging is cheaper, but it's slower and it requires some specific equipment inside your vehicle, and all the vehicle cannot do level 2 charging. So when you pick the vehicle, you have to take care about that. When it comes to level 3 charging, it's a little bit more expensive, and especially the maintenance of those charging stations will cost a little bit more, but you will be able to charge in a faster way. And when you consider the charging, you also need to consider the power management, and it's very important. If you put all your charging infrastructure at the same place, you will require a lot of power on the same site, and then it may cost a lot to you. So when you are deploying, or in fact defining your charging infrastructure, you need to be very careful about the power management options that are available, but you need also to consider the space distribution. Having an electric school bus, according to what I've heard from the different fleet manager, is that it reduces your infrastructure space or your parking lot space by about 15 to 20%. So it means that you have to dedicate about 15% of your parking lot for the charging infrastructure installation, meaning the transformator, power distribution, stuff like that, will take some space in your parking lot. So the bigger your fleet is, the smaller the ratio is, but if you have a fleet with 10 vehicles, you need to dedicate 1 or 2 spots for the charging infrastructure. It's very important, and you have to take this into account. So I know that it's quite quick, but maybe through the different questions we will have, I will be able to answer and go more in detail. But you have also all this information in the guide, and you will have also much more detail if you look at the guide. So what you really need to consider is making the transition is not just a vehicle, it's a vehicle plus the charging infrastructure plus the building and the maintenance things that come with it. So you have to take into account all of this when you are doing your transition. And I think that, Valérie, we can maybe go through the question.
Great, thank you so much. So if folks do have questions, they can put it in the questions section in the bottom right of your screen. So as people are thinking of their questions, we can ask a few of Stéphane. So first, is an electric school bus more complicated to repair and maintain? And what kind of specialized training is required for driving and maintaining ESBs?
Yeah, so as I said, it's not difficult to maintain, it's more specific because you bring some new software and electronics and electricity inside the bus. So you need to develop some new skill for your maintenance team. It's no longer just mechanics. And even in the ICE combustion engine vehicle, you can see that there is more and more electronics in those vehicles, but it's still very mechanical skills that are needed. When you come to an electric school bus, you need to be able to manage all the wiring, because sometimes you may have some corrosion on the wiring, and so being able to redo some connection. So this is some specific needs. But mainly it's when you have a problem on the vehicle, you need to debug it. And what I mean by debug, it's related to software. So you need to be able to connect to the computer, the onboard computer, be able to make the analysis. So it's some more, I would say, technical, not technical skills, but mainly electronics and electrics.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a question from...
Yeah, Nicole, if I can go on the maintenance side, you also need to consider the maintenance of the charging infrastructure. And for this, usually you have an agreement with the charging infrastructure provider that will do the maintenance, but you need to have a level 1 capability to debug the charging infrastructure. So it means that you need to have somewhere on site which is who is capable to do some debugging of the charging infrastructure. So that's also a new maintenance skills that has to be developed.
Okay, great point. We have a next question from Tom. The theoretical savings for maintenance has been well published. Have those savings actually materialized in practice?
For which savings, sorry?
Theoretical savings for maintenance.
Yeah, in fact, it's just that you have less oil chain and everything, but what I don't have any figure right now, but what I've seen in the different fleet is that it's about 20% of cost reduction for the maintenance. The thing is that you have less failure, you have less maintenance, but when you have a failure, usually it could cost a little bit more to fix it. So the reduction is not that big on that side. It's just that you need more qualified people to do the maintenance, and so at the end it's almost balanced, and you have close to 20% reduction, but not much more.
Okay, thank you. We'll go one last question then. There's no more from the chat. The average legal lifetime of diesel buses is about 10 to 12 years. Do electric buses last longer? And how long until the battery must be replaced?
So the vehicle is supposed to last longer because the electric motor need less maintenance and is more reliable. However, as I said, the battery will lose the capacity through the age. So as of today, we don't have any electric school bus who have more than 12 years of age. So it's really difficult to say. Everything is a theory. But depending on the manufacturer, some of them said that we may require to change the battery after 8 years, but most of them are targeting to have a 12-year lasting bus. So in fact, it should not change anything. And some of them even plan to have buses that are lasting longer than 12 years.
Okay, right. We have one more minute, so we'll sneak in a last question from Harold. Can school buses use public fast chargers?
Yeah, so yes, you can. So it could be an alternate solution, and I think that maybe in the next panelist we'll talk about this. But yes, electric school bus can use public charging infrastructure. So if you have a charging infrastructure on your depot, which is not sufficient for any reason, you can go on the public infrastructure and charge your bus. You need to be very careful. As I said, you have the level 2 charging and the level 3 charging. So some vehicles are able to make both, use both charging infrastructure. Some of them can just use the level 3 charging infrastructure, which means that you have to use the fast public charging infrastructure.
Okay, wonderful. We've come to the end of our time for that question period, but I see more great questions coming into the chat. So Stefan, maybe if you can type some of the responses for those. And
okay.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We will pass it on to Brad, the next presentation.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Valerie and team for having Highland join this awesome webinar. And Stefan, great presentation, super helpful, by the way. So without further ado, as Valerie mentioned earlier previously, my name is Brad Laporte, Regional Business Manager for Highland Electric Fleets. Currently reside in Prince Edward Island. And it's funny, my topic is cold weather and performance today because we went from a balmy 7 degrees yesterday to about a minus 12 today. So very, very uncool. But without further ado, just kind of a quick backdrop of kind of who Highland is and what we do and where we are in the market. Essentially, we're a comprehensive turnkey solutions provider. So what that means is, you know, we take on all the risk up front by, you know, managing all the upfront capital, digging the ground up with infrastructure, vehicle deployment. We reimburse for all maintenance costs, repair costs, training for drivers, mechanics, all on our dime, not the school districts or the local third-party fleet operators. As we all know on this call, the complexities are substantial. Currently, we have just over 400 electric school buses under contract across North America. And growing as we speak. Currently, we have about 150 units on the road scattered between Massachusetts, Vermont, Colorado, and in Montgomery County in the US as well. It's a quick highlight. We're the first turnkey solution provider that implemented a vehicle to grid program in Vermont and Massachusetts. And we are currently the largest operator of the biggest electrification school bus project on the planet in Montgomery County, which is 326 units currently under contract and about 85 or 90 currently on the road there operating daily. 2 main offices in the US. First is in Massachusetts, just on the North Shore of Boston. Second is in Colorado, and of course up here out of PEI, where we travel ongoing weekly to visit school districts and local third-party fleet operators. So without further ado, I thought we would kind of kick things off with the biggest questions that we get from travels on the road with our experience. And the first one always is, you know, how complicated, you know, is an electric school bus to drive versus a traditional diesel? And the short answer is it's a lot easier. You know, a diesel bus traditionally has about 1,800 moving parts. Depending on the OEM and spec, you're looking at between 26 to 28 moving parts on electric school bus. So if you factor in all that from, you know, from payload, from weight on the road, it's much quieter, it's much smoother. And with all the less moving parts, it gives the OEM's ability to add key crucial safety features on top of a traditional diesel. And I'm living proof. I have, you know, five young children under 13, and 4 of them are fortunate enough to ride an electric school bus daily out here in PEI. And I continuously have conversations with drivers, and they do not want to touch a diesel ever again for those reasons. Second big question, do you need specialized trains? Short answer is absolutely. Each OEM requires different training prescribed by that specific OEM based on the model specs provided by each. Just a kind of quick added note is that Highland, our model will cover all that expense training for driving as well, which is important, as if you have the privilege to speaking with a driver that has transitioned, you know, from a diesel to electric, they will allude that, yeah, the training is super important to get on board with off the hop to become an early adopter of how these things work on the road. And we'll dive into those criteria aspects later on in the presentation. Range, it's an interesting topic. Again, each OEM, you know, has their own specs, i.e. with those specs come claims. How we kind of gear it from, you know, our experience on the road is you can look at anywhere between, call it 160 to 240 kilometers. But with that being said, to be transparent, we don't tell our customers, especially up here in north, and you're looking at Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and those, you know, cold climates, you don't want to go anywhere above 120 kilometers based on those optimal operating conditions. And that's just being truthful, transparent, and upfront. Now, if you're looking at a market like Ontario and in ideal, call it climate and conditions, yeah, you can get 160 to 240 range without question. With our vehicle, typical charging up time is about 3 hours from call it dead state battery all the way to, anywhere upwards between 90 and 100%. Another key attribute is electric motors and batteries are designed to be efficient in cold and heat. And this is an ongoing topic with anxiety, especially being up north. We get a ton of questions is like, well, hey, my drivers have to literally sit in their diesel buses for up to 30 minutes for that unit to become warm. And with electric bus, you're talking 10 minutes max in a minus 30 degrees Celsius climate. So I'll be happy to share more after some folks too. I'm sure this will be a hot topic of discussion. As well, electric vehicle upgrades lead to better performance than diesel in weather conditions. We have data proven that this is a formula of success, and we have literally taken anxiety away from many, many folks on the ground driving these units daily and operating, from people transportation heads to transportation directors, to more importantly, my role, the mechanics and the school drivers that use these things on a daily basis. Next slide, extreme weather. It ranges again, and it depends on the climate. From Prince Edward Island, where you can, leave your house at a minus 10 and drive home after work at a plus 10, depending on the time of the year. It's all relative to the climate. Range also decreases due to the higher cabin heating and call it the energy used to maintain the battery's internal temperature. But again, that's all correlated to different specs, to route metrics, to terrain, i.e. is it hilly? Is it a flat surface? Is it charging during the day? Are they doing, afternoon routes in between AM and PM routes? So there's all these factors and variables that you always have to keep in the forefront of your mind when you're looking at electrifying school buses. Smart charging automates and fully manages bus charging, targeting times of low demand overnight. It's pretty simple. Takes 3 hours or less. I think we touched on that within a 12-year period, which is great. So typically, if you are parked at a depot, you plug in as soon as you park and you unplug in the morning. And with that being said, in Montgomery County, where we have, call it 85 units operating today, the drivers will tell you that sometimes they don't even plug in after their routes because of the battery being still at 80 to 80% charge after an AM and PM daily route. And again, that kind of segues into operational management in cold weather, because you never want to drive an electric school bus at 100% full state of charge. You always want to have it optimal between 80 and 90%. And we can kind of stick handle that to later on too, if you wish. Mitigate issues with daytime power outages, but also saves on 40 to 60% charger costs, which is huge. I believe Stefan dived into that earlier as well. This is a testimonial for one of our drivers who operates in a colder climate, which is just north of Boston in Massachusetts. And food for thought is this school district came in and wanted to electrify, call it 2 school buses off the hop, because they had the anxiety of range, they had the anxiety of cold weather. And what we did on our dime is future-proof the entire depot of 24 in faith that he was going to see the cost savings and the benefit in cold weather, from a diesel to electric. And guess what? He gave us the nod a few months ago to fully electrify his entire fleet of 24 units, which is exciting. So food for thought, real people, real applications, real world on the ground. Again, this is another topic of discussion that comes up on a regular basis. What happens when the grid goes out? And the good news is that these range, as we talked about, in optimal conditions can go 160 to 240 kilometers, and in not, call it less ideal climate and call it terrain climate, is you're looking at 120. So you're still good. In Beverly, for example, we've had buses parked for weeks that haven't been used, i.e. during the summer. And when they came to use it, call it in their maintenance checkup in early, August, after 5 or 6 weeks of being dead, it started right away, full state of charge as they left it. So food for thought there. These batteries in EV school buses are evolving almost on the 90-day cycle. And massive cold weather testing, massive cold weather data. And internally, Highland, we cold test these things all the time to prove the model. It's the only way it's really gonna resonate up here in Canada. A solution to grid issues, which is important. Consider these school buses giant batteries on wheels. And in Beverly, Massachusetts, and in Montgomery, and currently in Colorado, in peak to peak, we've actually used our school buses to drive out to the power outages within the community. And one that sticks out is a strip mall in Massachusetts, where instead of trying to pin down a high voltage company on a cold winter day and trying to get there, call it, boom trucks and, their 25 staff of high voltage electricians that are scattered around, that city, is we literally drove the bus to the power outage, hooked it up, and got backup power for everybody to get through what they needed to get through. So super important here that, these buses act as that component as well, direct energy resources. And kind of off topic is it's a massive opportunity for folks to give back to the communities. That kind of concludes, my presentation regarding cold weather. I know I kind of skipped around a little bit from point to point, but there's a lot to it. So I'm hoping I can open it up to questions and real world thoughts, and we can answer them to the best of your ability. And if I don't have the answers, hang tight. I'll find them for you and get them to you via email. So thanks again for your time, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. We have a few questions already in the chat, quite a lot of interest around heating. So I'll jump right into it. From Sean, I understand the need for non-battery heating in electric school buses, but have noticed most use diesel heating systems. Why diesel versus propane or other cleaner fuel?
Yeah, we're just talking straight heating component, correct?
I believe.
Yeah, Highland, if you can only speak for, call it, our use case scenarios, we do try to use our best to avoid fossil powered heating. However, in our climate, it's obviously necessary in some cases. I know out here in PI, we have the auxiliary heaters. In Alberta, they have the auxiliary heaters, etc. And so the use of the fossil fuel heating will depend on a couple variables as well: route length and OEM spec. There's certain OEMs that have to use an aux heater, and there's certain OEMs that have built-in specs where you don't need to apply that aux heater as an additional heating component. Highland does have two IC, call it, operating units in Denver, and partner with also a Thomas built, and we don't use aux heaters on those particular units because the OEM has built into spec. Now we do work with other OEM operators, OEM manufacturers that we are going to be using aux heaters because of the climate. There's just no way around it. So I hope that answers your question to a certain degree.
Great. And next question is there a preheat system on a bus like a Webasto heater?
Yes. Short answer is yes.
Okay.
Certain OEMs have them, and certain ones don't. I know for, working with Thomas Built that they do. And that's kind of the information that I would have on that. But short answer is yes, absolutely.
Great. And from Mary, you claim charge time of 3 hours. What type of charger are you using? AC, DC level?
It's a fast charger. Sorry, yeah, it's a fast charger. Due to, call it, anxiety issues we were the first to market with such a large scale deployment with 35 units off the hop, is we had to really diminish that anxiety. So we really had to go above and beyond, improve the model. So yeah, it would be a level 3 fast charger regarding the 3 to 4 hour call it charge mechanisms. But if you're looking at a level 2, you're looking at anywhere between 8 to 11 hours, again, depending on the spec of charger. So yeah, some added context. Yeah.
Okay, great. Does Highland have a presence in BC?
In British Columbia?
I believe that's what they're referring to.
You know what? That's a great question. We are in deep dialogue with a few school districts and as well a couple local 3 p.m. operators. So short answer is, are we operating today? No, but will we be? Absolutely.
Great. And we will finish up this question period with a question from Cheryl. That backup power example is so good, Brad. Is there anything public out there on that example where you were able to use the bus for backup power?
Yeah, you know what, Cheryl, what I can do for you is if you want to send me a quick note to that email, which I believe is on screen, I can send you a ton of links and really cool literature regarding that component. There's lots to it, and it's really, really informative. I'd be happy to share with you. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks so much. I see a couple more questions coming in, but we do need to move on. So Brad, if you can also answer those typing,
sure.
That would be a big help. Thank you. All right, then we will pass it over to Jeff for our final presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this panel. Really exciting topic. My own personal experience, my son just rode on a electric school bus for the first time about a month ago. He was so excited. The kids on the bus were calling out to him to let him know that it was an electric school bus because they knew he's a bit of a cheerleader for electric vehicles. So yeah, I think this has been a really fun discussion. Hearing a lot about all the benefits of school buses, electric school buses, and how they can work. I was asked to join the panel to speak specifically about this topic of using electric school buses with vehicle to grid, basically using these things as distributed energy resources. So it's a really exciting topic, and I'm eager to dive into that. Just quickly about myself. So my name is Jeff Turner. I'm the Director of Clean Mobility at Dunsky. We're a Canadian firm of about 50 people, entirely focused on the energy transition. So generally helping governments, utilities, other organizations figuring out what they can do to accelerate the clean energy transition. So my own focus, of course, is really on enabling transportation electrification. That's a big part of the clean mobility space. And so sometimes that's helping figure out, forecasting adoption, developing strategies, incentives, and programs to accelerate adoption. But we also do a lot of work with fleets. In particular, my colleague, Maddie Ewing, leads our fleet analysis branch. And in that case, we're looking at the potential for electrification, developing the business case, a strategy or a roadmap for transitioning a fleet. And so, often we're looking pretty closely at, what is it going to cost to acquire vehicles and infrastructure, but also what are the potential savings opportunities? And, most of the time, the big focus there is on fuel savings, maintenance savings, some of the things we've talked about already. But a topic that comes up specifically in the school bus space is this question of vehicle to grid, the idea of leveraging these large mobile batteries as assets that can provide power back to the grid. And so I'll take a couple slides here just to walk through what we really mean by vehicle to grid. And first of all, just in terms of terminology, I think it's helpful to just understand a few different categories of technologies. And vehicle to grid is one aspect of a broader suite of solutions called vehicle grid integration. It's unfortunate that the terms are fairly similar, but vehicle grid integration is actually a broader term that includes a number of approaches for minimizing the impact of EVs on the grid and potentially even turning EVs into an overall asset or net benefit for the grid. The most simple forms of vehicle grid integration would be things like smart charging. And we've already talked about this a little bit, the idea of timing when charging happens, maybe shifting away from peak periods on the grid, potentially even synchronizing charging with variable renewables. You can imagine charging ramping up when there's a surplus of wind generation. And you can do this either through direct control with control signals or through behavioral approaches with different price signals. But generally in those cases, we're always talking about unidirectional power flow, just modulating when power goes into the vehicles. Vehicle to grid, on the other hand, is a much more complex interaction where we're talking about actually pulling power out of those vehicles, sending it back to the grid to provide a number of different services. So those services can include a wide range of things that can basically generally help the utility. Probably the simplest example would be, offsetting peak demand. It's one thing to pause charging during a peak period for the grid. It's a whole other thing if you can not only pause charging, but then pull power out of that vehicle to support the utility in handling that peak load. That's probably the simplest approach, but there are a number of other services that distributed energy resources, whether that be a vehicle or distributed solar or energy storage systems. And a lot of them have to do with basically helping the utility to maintain that delicate balance of supply and demand on the grid. So batteries are really good at that because they can respond very quickly and help the grid basically be much more flexible in satisfying that demand. Those are sort of more kind of utility services. The table on the right, you can see we're also listing some customer services. And I think the most exciting there, we just mentioned this, Brad, on the previous presentation, the idea of leveraging vehicles as backup power sources or remote power sources in remote areas. This is really exciting. I've been nerding out about this for a number of years. I even actually, I powered my wedding reception with EV batteries over 10 years ago. So I think there's a lot of excitement about this idea. It's a little bit harder to quantify the value of that kind of a service because, of course, it's kind of a what-if scenario. That reassurance that you have, an alternate means of powering, say, an emergency facility or something like that. But I think that is really what's getting a lot of people excited about the idea of electric vehicles and offering a lot of flexibility for how they power their grids or their buildings. So I think at this point, there's a distinction that I sometimes gloss over when generally talking about EV charging, but I think it's important making this distinction in the discussion of vehicle to grid because it has an important impact on how we actually implement this. There's been a few questions here about whether we're talking about level 2 charging or level 3 or DC fast charging. Generally speaking, AC charging, that would be either level 1 or level 2, is where we're providing AC power to a vehicle. And that's the same kind of power you have in your house from a regular outlet or maybe a larger appliance at 240 volts. You're providing that alternating current power to the vehicle. And there's an onboard component that converts that AC power to DC to charge the battery. Because the battery is always DC, just like a AA battery, there's a positive and a negative. So you need that power conversion to be able to charge the vehicle. This is important for vehicle to grid because if you want to pull power out of the vehicle, that onboard charger is what needs to have bidirectional capability. That's the device that's controlling the flow of power. And in the case of AC charging, that component is built into the vehicle. For DC charging, and this is what we sometimes call level 3 charging for light duty vehicles, this is the kind of thing that'll charge a car in half an hour, or it might be an appropriate type of overnight charging for school buses, just given the power demand. In DC charging, that power conversion from AC to DC happens in the charging station itself. And so it goes into the vehicle through a DC charging port, bypasses that onboard charger and goes straight to the battery. So that means that the device, if we want to enable bidirectional charging, and for DC charging, it's actually that off-board charger that needs that capability. And from the vehicle perspective, it should be possible to pull power out of that vehicle without any kind of onboard equipment. All you really need is software on the vehicle that isn't going to throw all sorts of errors and cause problems if it sees power going the wrong way and it doesn't expect it. So from a certain perspective, it's simpler to implement vehicle to grid with those DC or level 3 chargers. It's also simpler from the perspective of integrating with the grid because that offboard equipment really doesn't look that different from the type of inverter that you would need with an energy storage system or a solar array. It's a fixed piece of equipment that can be certified and approved by the utility, that it can provide power back to the grid in a safe manner. And it's just a little bit more complicated to do that kind of certification with something that's on a vehicle and that moves around and that doesn't necessarily know where on the grid it's connected and whether or not it's safe to provide bidirectional charging capability. So just to summarize, essentially what we're saying here is that DC charging is a little bit more straightforward in terms of implementing vehicle to grid. It's not impossible to do it with AC charging, but that seems to be the way things are going. And the vast majority of pilots that have been done so far have used that kind of a charging layout. Overall, though, what we're talking about here, no matter how you do it, we're talking about slowing or even reversing the charging process. It's really important to consider, how does this fit in with that vehicle providing its primary function, which is going to be transporting kids to and from school. So if vehicle to grid is going to work, it absolutely has to be done with a smart charging platform that can make sure that whatever these vehicles are doing in support of the grid, it's not happening at the expense of that primary function. So platforms are available out there that can make sure that you program in departure times. So this system knows that if it's going to be providing some grid services, it will know that it has to top up that vehicle again by the time of the next departure. You can also set things like minimum state of charge. So that might be if you want to make sure that no matter what happens, you always have a minimum reserve of power in that bus in case there's an unexpected trip that needs to happen. But overall, I think the big opportunity here, though, is that these vehicles, as with personal light-duty vehicles, they spend the vast majority of their time sitting parked. Brad mentioned how quickly you can charge a vehicle with the right charging equipment. And that just means that there's a lot of flexibility here for a vehicle to be leveraged. And this is, valuable asset that you've integrated into your fleet. It's possible to make use of this downtime and earn additional revenue through some of these vehicle to grid services. So we did some analysis recently with the Alliance to try to quantify what those potential revenue streams might look like. It's a little bit tricky in Canada because, of course, we don't have any vehicle to grid programs or rates that have been established yet. But just based on some of the analysis, we do a lot of analysis with utilities across Canada to understand, the potential for savings through energy efficiency programs and solar and storage programs. And we estimated, just based on existing programs, what type of revenue you might be able to expect. Factoring in, of course, that you won't necessarily always be able to leverage that bus for participation on the grid if it's not a good time. Probably the best example is here in Quebec. We often have peak events during the morning on weekdays in the winter. And so those are times when a bus isn't necessarily available to support the grid. But looking at a few different provinces, you can get the sense of what kind of additional revenue this might bring into a fleet operator. And it's pretty significant. This could really offset, a good share of the overall operational costs and improve the overall payback period by maybe a year or two over the course of thanks to that additional revenue. Now, of course, we know that this isn't the only opportunity here. There's a number of funding opportunities available to fleets that are looking to incorporate electric buses. But we think that vehicle to grid revenue is a really important component here that could really improve the economics. Now, there's a question about how is this going to evolve over time. I would say that, right now, a big difference with Canada is that we're sitting pretty good. A lot of our grids are pretty robust. We have a lot of electric heating. So that means that we've got a lot of electrical capacity, but we're looking to electrify a lot of loads, the transportation sector, building heating. And over time, we expect that the capacity of the grid is going to need to be optimized. And so we expect that over time, there could be more programs coming down the pipeline, more rates to incentivize fleets to allow their vehicles to participate in that kind of functionality. But of course, this is going to vary significantly across the country, depending on whether grids are peaking in the winter or in the summer, and a number of other regional aspects that can impact the potential here. And finally, I'll just mention on battery degradation, there's already some questions about lifespan of buses and whether batteries need to be replaced. It is a question. Obviously, cycling a battery, pulling power out of the battery to power the grid or your backup power system, that adds additional usage on the battery. So it really just comes down to a question of, how does that compare to the typical usage, and how does that compare to the overall lifespan of the vehicle? Because there are some cases where, if vehicles aren't being used heavily enough, it's very likely that those batteries will outlast the life of the vehicle altogether. So if the incentive structure is there, it can mean that the additional revenue from vehicle to grid services is really a worthwhile pursuit, as it'll improve the overall economics for that asset that you've got sitting in your parking lot. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there could be a lot of questions to dive a little bit deeper on some of these topics. So I'll just see where the interests lie. And I'll just mention in the meantime that we've put together a technical briefing with the Alliance on V2G with electric school buses, and that should be available shortly. And you'll be able to see some of the details on the analysis that we've done on this topic. So thanks very much. Looking forward to your questions.
All right, thanks so much, Jeff. Really interesting. I'll jump right into questions. Benoit had a question about the battery degradation. So Benoit, if you have follow-up questions, then feel free to add those, but I feel that was probably addressed.
So I actually had, I worked for an electric vehicle manufacturer back in 2011, 2012. The company doesn't exist, but one of my last meetings there was with our battery supplier about how to deal with vehicle to grid and monitoring battery degradation. From the battery manufacturer's perspective, it was really just a question of having some means of quantifying that use. You know, we're all used to vehicle warranties tracked against an odometer number. We know that once we hit a certain odometer level, then that's going to have an impact on our warranty. So from the battery company's perspective, vehicle to grid was just like any other usage of the battery, but it was just a matter of figuring out a way to communicate, you know, how often is that battery being used and making sure that the owner of those vehicles is seeing that data. But overall, I would say that I think the relatively low usage of school buses, you know, the fact that they're not used, they're not, you know, doing hundreds of kilometers a day and they're not used for a good chunk of the year. These strike us as assets that are otherwise underutilized, and that additional cycling can fit within the usual expected lifetime of a bus.
Okay, very interesting. Next question is from Sam. First, Jeff, great presentation. Curious your thoughts on the business model for V2B. Does that become part of regional emergency management plans long-term and somehow compensated through those?
Yeah, so it's a little bit fuzzy to define, you know, where are we talking about vehicle to grid versus vehicle to building? And you know, same for vehicle to home with personal vehicles. I'd say that customer services on the right side there, you might call those vehicle to building services, because, you know, buildings already have, you know, a relationship with the utility, and they can offset their demand with their vehicle in a way that'll say reduce demand charges or shift their use of energy against a time of use schedule. So those functionalities can, you know, there can be a pretty decent business case just based on some of those services. But I think the official definition of vehicle to building would be in a case where you're not connected to the grid. And so that just becomes much harder to quantify in terms of the value. I suppose you could look at, you know, what are facilities paying for backup generators and that kind of a service. But it's like I said, it's kind of a what if scenario. You want that peace of mind, that reassurance that you've got a solution to keep the lights on. But it gets a little bit harder to quantify the actual financial value there.
Okay. Next question is from Harold. When will electric school buses stop providing onboard charging?
That's a good question. Something that we've been asking a lot, because I think, you know, we've had this question about whether, you know, buses can make do with level 2 chargers or just use DC charging. I'll go back to that little diagram that I have here. And yeah, if you're only ever going to use DC charging, then it becomes a question as to whether it's worthwhile putting that onboard charger on the vehicle. And I believe there are some manufacturers that are already taking that component out of the bus, and that reduces the cost of the bus, you know, maybe by a few $1,000s just by not having to have that piece of equipment. So I think it is happening. That said, you know, I'd say that one downside is that the vehicle might be a little bit less flexible in terms of being able to find alternate charging locations. It's really nice having, you know, a school bus with an AC charger on board can plug in at any home, essentially. It might need a higher power AC charger. But so that's the risk that you'd be taking with a DC only approach, is you'd be narrowing down your options for charging up away from your fleet depot.
Okay, great. We have 2 more questions here, and then we'll give ourselves lots of time for the panel. So Joshua says, great presentation. Do you have examples of utilities across the provinces that are developing their demand response and V2G programs?
Yeah, so it's still fairly early days. I keep going back to the fact that, if you look down in California, the grid is just so much more constrained that they're really motivated to roll out these programs, and they have been doing so for some time. Canada's a little bit behind on that front. We're pretty far ahead on encouraging electrification because of our robust grids, but that also means that we hasn't been quite as urgent to encourage things like smart charging your vehicle to grid. We have seen a number of pilots across Canada. I used to work at BC Hydro, and they have a few. They've done some trials for light duty vehicles. And more are coming on that front, with an initial focus on smart charging, and a few other utilities across the country are doing this as well. Nova Scotia Power has also done some initial trials with vehicle to grid, but I'd say it's really at that sort of trial stage, and they're not really rolling that out on a broader program level just yet. So it's still pretty early days on the V2G front, but I think absolutely demand response, smart charging. Hydro-Quebec, other utilities are beginning to roll out programs like Hilo or variable pricing dynamic electricity rates that are encouraging off-peak charging. And I think fleets really need to stay on top of that and recognize whether there are some opportunities to optimize when they're charging their vehicles to minimize costs.
Okay, fabulous. And I think you answered our other question about V2G activities in Quebec. So well done. We covered it all. Great. Then I think we will move on to the panel discussion component of the session. So I'll turn it over to Valerie.
Thank you. I will just switch on over the slides here. Perfect. Well, thank you for all of your questions, and to all three panelists for your presentation. So for this last segment of the webinar, we'd now like to hear you speak more generally about the future of operating electric school buses in Canada. So my first question, which was also asked in the chat, is regarding home charging. So as you probably know, drivers, often those who operate in rural areas or live far from the depot, have often raised the issue that they cannot charge their electric school buses at home. So to address this issue, the government of PEI has initiated a pilot project for the installation of charging stations at selected bus drivers' homes. And so our question is, across Canada, what is the potential for homeschool bus charging? We can start perhaps with Brad on this question.
I think the viability and sustainability is super important. I think what needs to happen is we need to really engage key stakeholders on the ground as well at the top, and somehow meet in the middle, articulate an action plan and roll it out. And what that by means, I think, OEMs, the Highland Electrics of the world, the Jeffs of the world, and Stephans of the world, etc., really need to get together and figure out how can we roll this out from a pricing component, but also a real world component as well. But there's such a dire need for it. I know along my travels, that is my number 2 or 3 questions. Okay, you can electrify your depot, which is awesome, but what about my 8% of drivers that park at home? And so we do offer, call it at-home charging solutions as proof of concepts as well. So maybe I'll pass the puck over to Stefan. I'm sure he has some valuable insight as well on that topic.
All right, thank you, Brad. Stefan, did you want to share on this?
Yeah, I think that it's really a challenge because when you want to charge at home, level 2 has to be considered, and it's very difficult to consider level 3 at home. So that's one of the key challenges, that you need to have a vehicle which has a level 2 capability. And most of the challenge is also related to the financial compensation, because it's really difficult to identify how much electricity has been used by the bus compared to the home. So that's one key. On the other side, there is a benefit of charging at home, which is like you spread the power usage through the grid. Not all the buses are charging at the same place. So you reduce the power consumption at one place. And as I said, the charging infrastructure challenge in a depot is that you are bringing new new components that are using space in your depot. So We need to work on the home charging, definitely. And I think that the key challenge is how you evaluate how much electricity is used by the bus compared to the house. So that's the key challenge. Other than that, with a level 2 charging station, it could be used and works well for if you have one bus at home. If I saw the picture, there is already 2 buses at home on your slide, and it starts to be a challenge when you have 2 buses. So it's like a small depot after.
I would almost say that even with one bus, I mean, we have it pretty good in Quebec because there's a lot of homes are heated electrically, so that means our electrical capacity at the home level is pretty substantial. Elsewhere in the country, where often homes are heated with fossil fuels, electrical panels may be a little bit more constrained, and the kind of high power levels that you need, we're not talking about a standard, say 7 kilowatt level 2 charger for a bus. You'd really need something more powerful. And that might start to be a challenge on some older homes or homes that only have limited electrical panels. But ultimately, I think Stéphane's main point about distributing charging geographically is an overall benefit. And it shouldn't be out of the question that utilities could be considering a special allowance for the installation of a new dedicated service that's separate from the residential account that can support a charger that's in the driveway of a resident. So I don't think this is insurmountable, but definitely a little bit trickier in those parts of the country with limited electrical power in homes.
Can I add one more thought to that too? From a human capital perspective, it is a logistical nightmare trying to figure out what drivers are going to quit and who are not going to quit, because you have to install a separate meter run. But yeah, I see Stéphane nodding. So yeah, I thought I'd add that little tidbit in there as well.
That's a good point.
When the driver quit, you don't know, you pay for the installation infrastructure. You can get the charger back, but you cannot have the price for the charging infrastructure. So it's a nightmare to manage, and you need to have a very stabilized staff in order to do that.
Well, thank you all 3 for your answers. I think we're all very excited to see what will be the final results of the pilot project in PI and see how other provinces can learn from their experience. I don't think there are any questions from our participant in the chat, so I will move to our second question. So yeah, initially we had here a question related to V2G uptake, more specifically about why the uptake of V2G-enabled ESBs is delayed in Canada in comparison to the US, where in recent years there have been several reports and pilot projects on this. But I think Jeff has mostly covered this when answering your question. So I think perhaps what we'll do, we'll go to the second question. If after it we have time left, maybe we can address some of the questions still in the chat here. And also, if you have more question on the feasibility of V2G-enabled ESBs in Canada, maybe not right now, but after the webinar, as mentioned, we have Dunsky upcoming brief on this, or you can always also just email directly to Jeff for this.
Valérie, maybe if we can just jump here, because we are talking about V2G, which is maybe a little bit farther in the process, and Jeff talked about smart charging, which is V1G, but which is very important. The smart charging, you have to consider it when you are deploying charging infrastructure. And there are more and more solutions on the market, and especially with Cléo in Quebec, who are bringing smart charging infrastructure with AI, which allow you to plan your charging, to reduce the cost in the maximum, to have the lower cost and reduce the power cost of your energy consumption. And I think that the first step before going to V2G, the first step is to implement a very good smart charging strategy. And as I said just a little bit earlier, try to avoid to put all your charging infrastructure at the same place. If you have 2 depots, don't start to say one depot will be electric, the other one will be a ice combustion engine. It's a bad way to do it. It's better to do the 2 depot with less charging infrastructure on each. So spread as much as you can your charging infrastructure.
Thank you, Stefan, for this mention. We will make sure to include it in our blog that will be summarizing all of what was presented here today. If there are no questions on this, I will go to our final question for our panelists. So our last question for you is about overcoming the barriers that are associated with operating ESBs. So actually many of the perceived technical barriers have been demystified during this session, making clear that it is no longer a challenge. So we'd be interested in knowing, so beyond financial incentives such as the ZETF fund or other provincial funding and policies that are in place, what would you recommend the provincial or federal government do to overcome these barriers and myths to ESB adoption? Like, are there any other stakeholders that could be involved beyond the government? What policies or targets could be implemented? So the question is for all 3 panelists. So the floor is open.
So maybe I can start. I think that one thing is really education. We need to educate everybody, so the fleet manager, but also the driver and the user. This is that will reduce all the barrier. As you said, technical barrier are no longer here, but there is still some charging infrastructure challenge. So it's not a technical barrier, but you have the challenge to do the implementation. We talk about the home charging, which is also another challenge. So we need to rethink part of the operation and to rethink the way we are doing the charge transportation for a part of it. So education of all the different people in the chain for the transportation, to think about the way that they distribute the route. So all those kind of things have to be made. So education is the key in order to help to reduce all the barrier.
Thank you, Stefan. Maybe Jeff, do you want to share on this?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's definitely, education is definitely a big piece of the puzzle. I think right now, when we look at the financial opportunity, the programs that we have currently in terms of financial incentives are pretty important, because right now, just due to the low volumes, we're not, seeing the same cost reductions that we've already seen with light duty vehicles. So we still do have some ways to go in terms of ramping up the scale and bringing those costs down over time. So I think financial incentives will continue to need to be a piece of the puzzle, and probably phased out gradually to avoid any significant disruption. But that's really just an evolution of existing programs. I think as far as new players go, I think, you probably got the sense from my presentation that I'm pretty excited about the utility integration opportunity here. So I think across the board, there are a lot of challenges on the utility side, but I think getting those utilities excited and aware of the opportunity here to leverage these valuable assets. I think there's a lot of hype about vehicle to grid, but if it makes sense anywhere, it's with school buses that are large batteries sitting around parked a good chunk of the day. And I think it's a real win-win opportunity if utilities can just sort of develop the programs that will bring about benefits to the grid and also improve the business case for the fleets operating those buses. I think that's what I would push for most strongly.
I think from my perspective, education, obviously we touched on, but I think supply chain needs to figure itself out. It's in dire shambles right now, but also I believe in call it a healthy competitive landscape. I think some tariffs and some other mechanisms need to be removed to give other OEMs equal playing field, to make sure that all of our children can get on these buses sooner than later. So I think those 2 things in parallel working together would help our market transition.
Thank you to you 3. Our Are there any last comments before maybe I think we can take a few minutes to answer the question in the chat?
Sure. I saw a question from Harold a few minutes ago asking about demand charges. And so, yeah, that's a really important point. We all know that we pay a fee based on the amount of energy that we consume, but commercial customers also pay a fee that's proportional to the peak demand that a facility hits during a month. And that can be pretty substantial. I would say that's a big part of the motivation for smart charging, managing when charging happens, making sure that if those buses only need a few hours of charging overnight, you don't need that all to happen at once. So that's a big opportunity. But in terms of programs and utility rate structures, BC Hydro out on the West Coast does have a fleet electrification rate that offers reduced demand charges temporarily for fleets that are running into this challenge. So that's one example. And we've worked with a few other utilities that are considering similar rate structures to sort of modulate these demand charges to make sure it's not killing the business case for whether that's electric school buses or other aspects of the EV transition.
Great. And since we have you on stage, Jeff, a question from Sean Barry. I'm not sure if you answered this already, but it says, thanks, Jeff. Do you know of any V2G bus projects or activities in Quebec?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specifically in Quebec. Obviously, there's been good progress there. A lot of school buses hitting the road here. But I if anything, there's probably some progress in terms of adapting to the critical peak pricing program, the dynamic pricing that Hydro-Quebec has rolled out, as well as potential offerings eventually from Hydro-Quebec's subsidiary Hilo. But that would all initially start with just smart charging. So shifting when charging happens. I'm not aware of any programs yet to actually leverage vehicle to grid. Hydro-Quebec has dabbled in that in the past with some demonstrations. But I think it really comes down to we're not quite as pressed. Our grid can handle the same kind of peak demand that California was struggling with last year with a much smaller population. So we've just got a much bigger grid here, and the other challenge, of course, is that our peaks are in the winter when school buses are in pretty heavy demand.
Oh, I think we lost Jeff. But I had here two other questions that perhaps Brad or Stefan, you're able to answer. So Errol was asking, when will EV school buses stop providing onboard charging, sorry.
I think it depends on the manufacturer. Some of them already remove them. It's really a matter of market needs, and as long as we need to do AC charging or level 2 charging, we will have them on board. So after it's really a matter of manufacturer strategy, I would say.
Great question. I know for folks that we currently operate with, if there's a driver that does an AM and a PM with a daily activity in between, we do work with other providers of charge packs to kind of take off that anxiety. But have they used the charge pack once? No. The state of charge has remained. So there's some food for thought. There are solutions out there to kind of take that anxiety off the table.
All right, great. And the last question that I think might have been already covered from Ryan, are the fast chargers that the buses use able to be used on smaller fleet, cars, etc.?
So the question is how we can use the charger for the buses on the smaller vehicle?
Exactly, or for fast chargers, more specifically for buses.
No, they are not specific. In fact, the fast charging infrastructure is common, and it could be used either for a bus, for a car, or anything like that. The thing is that if you bring a light vehicle on a fast charging, which is with a very high power, you will not be able to use the full power of the charging station, but you can still use it. This is the same gun and the same protocol in order to communicate for the charging infrastructure. So there is no restriction on that side.
All right, thank you for your answer. I think that covers all of the questions we've had. So unless there are any other comments or question, I will just pass now over to Nicole for the final remarks.
Yeah, maybe what I can say is that today we have some specialists here on the panel, and when you are doing the transition, as I said earlier, it's very important to plan, and planning is really the key. And if you don't have the resource, the manufacturer or the charging infrastructure installer, or even some consulting firm like Propulsion Québec or Dunsky are here to help you and have the resource to help you in that transition. And don't hesitate to ask to your bus provider, your charging infrastructure, or anybody else to help you on the transition. It's very important to have a well-planned project, and don't try things, because if you just try, you will be disappointed, and then you will not want to do the transition. If you are well support, you will have succeed in your transition.
Great. And I think I'll also give a chance to Brad and Jeff if they have any final thoughts or messages to share.
Oh, I mean, I think this has been super helpful, even for me listening to both Stefan and Jeff. I actually took a lot home, and I'm looking forward to actually collaborating with them both potentially in the future on some projects. So with that being said, I want to say thank you to Valerie, Nicole, and Anthony, and everybody else that made the time to join today. It's been great. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just add that I think this is super exciting, the work that the Alliance is doing. And my main takeaway is that electric school buses are just such a great opportunity, such a great, good news story. The vehicle to grid stuff can get people excited, but, first and foremost, thinking about, I mentioned my son riding on this electric school bus, how excited kids are about this new technology, direct benefits to them in terms of the air they're breathing, and but generally just contributing to the overall excitement and enthusiasm about electric transportation in general. I think it's a real great banner achievement here to electrify these school bus fleets.
Great, that's a fabulous note to end on. So I shall proceed to concluding remarks. So this wraps up our second online session hosted by the Canadian Electric School Bus Alliance on demystifying the operation of electric school buses in Canada. We encourage you to stay in touch with us by visiting our online resource library at eschoolbusalliance.ca. Join our bi-monthly newsletter. There will be a link in the chat for that. And follow our organizations, Equiterre and Green Communities Canada, on social media. As mentioned, we will soon be publishing a summary blog to share key highlights from today's webinar. That will also include Dunsky's upcoming technical brief on the potential for V2G-enabled ESBs, so please keep an eye out for that. We will also be releasing policy briefs for accelerating ESB adoptions in key Canadian provinces, as well as our report in collaboration with Dunsky on the feasibility of transitioning the entire Canadian school bus fleet by 2040 or earlier. This release will be followed by a symposium featuring panels, presentations, and workshops. And additionally, we are also always welcoming new members. So please check out our website or get in touch with us for more information on how to become a member. All attendees will receive shortly after the event the link to the recording and an appreciation survey. So we strongly encourage everyone to fill it out, as we'd like to get feedback to help improve future events. So finally, to close out the session, I would like to give a big thank you to our speakers today, Stefan, Brad, and Jeff, and of course, all of you for joining us today and contributing to such an engaging and informative session. So if there's no other questions or final remarks, I'll say thank you all, and we hope to see you at future CESBA events. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Great discussion.